So really happy to be here. So I've been told so that there's a very strong health economics group here. So very much looking forward to like receiving your comments and suggestions on it. So this project is a joint work with Tim, who is a pre-doc at Chicago booth. And the motivation for this paper is that now there is a lot of empirical evidence that gaps in children's IQ scores, their socio-emotional skills, other cognitive and non-cognitive skills, they appear early and they persist in later life. And when I say that they appear early, these gaps, so I mean really early, because there is fetal origins literature, so which traces the origin of these gaps between abilities and skills of children in the 9 months we spend in utero. For example, this is a quote from a very influential survey of this literature. And this says that in utero is one of the most critical periods for human skill formation. And if you experience even mild shocks during this period, so they can affect the trajectory of your lifetime outcomes. So then there is a lot of interest in causally relating these early life shocks, these in utero shocks, to your later life events, earnings, or other labor market outcomes. But this process is not easy for at least two reasons. So the first reason is that a lot of the shocks that human experience early in their life, especially in utero, so they're mild shocks. For example, the common shocks exploited in the literature are like nutrition deprivation, disease, stress. So they are mild shocks, but the outcomes, so they are measured a long time after the shock has occurred. So there are mild treatment. So there's mild treatment, and the outcomes are measured maybe 30 years after treatment. For example, if you take our context, if you consider our context, the shock is when you were in utero, but we are measuring earnings when you are 30, 40 years old. So there's a large gap between treatment and measurement of outcomes, and the treatment itself is quite mild. In that sense, so this is the measurement problem in this literature. And you cannot overcome this measurement problem unless you have a lot of precision and power in measuring outcomes. So we are calling this first challenge in identifying these effects as the measurement challenge. And this measurement challenge is complicated by the second challenge, so which is like the endogeneity challenge. So a lot of shocks that you experience in utero, so they are related, they are correlated with socioeconomic status of parents. For example, if we talk about famine, exposure to famine, hunger, disease, so then children with low socioeconomic parents, so they are expected to be exposed worse than the children of rich parents. So then to some extent, these shocks, so they are correlated with the parental characteristics, which are important determinants of later life outcomes. In that sense, so it will be very hard to separate these selection effects from the real effects of the shock. So this is like the exogeneity challenge, and there is a measurement challenge. And because of these two reasons, causally relating these in utero shocks to later life events is not easy. And what we do in this paper is we overcome these two challenges using an exogenous, plausibly exogenous shock to in utero environment. So what we exploit is this Ramadan fasting by pregnant Muslim women. And first half of the paper would be like convincing you that this shock is not correlated with parental observables. So this shock does not disproportionately affects rich versus poor children. So in fact, so we are going to show you that the timing of conception of children is independent of the onset of Ramadan. So this will be the first observation. So we overcome the second challenge, the first challenge, which was the measurement challenge using administrative data. And because we have access to universe of tax returns filed in Pakistan for 3 years, so then we measure outcome with a lot of power and precision. So which means if even very small differences in outcome across the exposed and unexposed group, we would be able to measure it because we have a lot of statistical power. So to give you some background of like what this in utero Ramadan shock is. So Ramadan is 9th month in the Islamic calendar, and Muslims, so they fast during this month. So fasting involves abstaining from food and drink throughout the day, from sunrise to sunset. So the last fast in the UK was 12th of May. So it started on like 2:45 in the morning and it ended on 8:45 in the evening. So then so fasting is essentially you do not eat anything, you do not drink anything during these 18 hours. So fasting, so it's not only a nutrition shock, but it also involves other type of shocks. So obviously, there is nutrition disruption because you are not eating anything during the day. So there is dehydration, you are not drinking anything. So then there are glucose swings. So glucose swings come from the fact that you have not eaten anything during the day. And when you break your fast, when you open your fast, so traditionally, you take food which is very rich in carbohydrates and sugars. For example, it's usually opened with dates. And obviously, there's disturbed sleep patterns. So this paper is about developing countries. Those of you who work in developing countries would be knowing that people there live in large families, and usually the young women of productive age, so they cook for the family. And if you have to like take breakfast at 3 a.m. in the morning, so they have to wake up like at 2 a.m. in the morning. So there is sleep disruption. So that's why we are not calling this Ramadan shock, nutrition shock. It is nutrition disruption, but it involves other shocks as well. So this is like a cocktail of shocks.
Mazhar, can I have a clarification here?
Yeah.
So other than this fasting, does this Ramadan also interrupt other aspects of your life, such as work, study, and everything else?
Yeah, it does. So it's like the whole schedule, your whole schedule is changed. So there are like shorter working hours. So people, in very hot countries, sometimes the office hours are changed so that you avoid like working during very, very hot hours. Yeah. There are other changes as well.
So in other words, there also a decrease in their energy consumption because of less work.
Yeah, so that's right. But people have like calculated the calorie loss because of Ramadan fasting, and overall it's still a negative effect.
Right.
Because
sure.
Even if like you work less, especially in offices, but that is more than made up by the fact that you have your calorie intake goes down by a lot.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
So this paper we will be focused on like fasting by pregnant women and the the religious injunctions are that the pregnant women, so they are not exempt. So there is like no clear exemption available to them from fasting, but there is like conditional exemption in the sense that if they feel that their fasting could harm them or their children, so they can skip it. And but if they decide to skip it, so then they have to make up for it by fasting later in the year. Okay. But despite this conditional exemption, so observance among pregnant Muslim women is quite high. So we give a lot of survey evidence that around 70% of women still fast despite this conditional exemption. Okay.
Mazhar, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know the context in Pakistan so well, but I remember a paper about Bangladesh where they show that the Muslim women were targeting their pregnancies to avoid the Ramadan month, right? There's Najmul Hassan's paper that I can send you in the chat here. And so to what extent that could be a problem to the identification here? So you said early on that they are not timing, but the fact that we find that in Bangladesh, to what extent that doesn't translate to the Pakistani context?
Yeah, so this is a very crucial question for us. If people are able to like time pregnancy to avoid or limit exposure of their kids to Ramadan in utero exposure, so then then this shock will be endogenous to your labor market outcomes. So that's why we take this very seriously, and I will present a lot of evidence in the first half of this presentation to convince you that this is not the case, at least in Pakistan.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so I was talking to Sean before the presentation, and Ramadan follows lunar year, so it's not based on solar calendar. So which means it is 11 days shorter than the solar year. So for example, if Ramadan starts today on 25th March in Australia, so the next year in 2023, it will start on the 15th of March. And thus in 33 years, it completes the cycle over the solar years. So after 33 years, it will again start on the 25th March. And in these 33 years, it would have completed the cycle around. So this is important for us because there is birth seasonality in outcomes, and we can control for this using like month of birth fixed effects. And we can do this only because Ramadan follows through this, circles through this Western calendar. So we can do it. So you can control for month of birth fixed effects only if you have access to 33 birth cohorts. So we have like 66 birth cohorts in our data. So we can very convincingly control for any birth seasonality in outcomes. Okay. And to give you some preview of results, so the first set of results, as I was saying to Tushar, would be that there is no selection in the sense that we look at a lot of outcomes and parents do not seem to choose the timing of conception of their kids to avoid this Ramadan exposure. And operationally, so we show you two things. We are going to show you that the birth rate does not vary systematically over the year. So there will be a flat line. And the second is the parental composition. It also does not vary across various months of conception. And by parental composition, I mean parents do not seem to have sorted in different conception months, in the sense that the rich parents, they are always, their children are conceived at one time, and the poorer parents, their children are conceived at a different time. So there does not seem to be any selection into Ramadan exposure. So then the second aspect of the paper is we would document the long run impact of in utero exposure. And here we find that this negatively affects earning. So people who are exposed in the middle part of the pregnancy, so their earnings are 2 to 3% lower than the unexposed people. And this estimate is a lower bound. So this estimate is lower bound for 2-3 reasons. So the first is our estimate has an intention to treat effect interpretation. So this is ITT because we do not observe fasting rate. As I told you that fasting among pregnant Muslim women is quite high, so it's 70%. But this is 70% if you ask them, have you fasted during pregnancy at least once during Ramadan? So 70% of Muslim women say yes. But if you ask, did you fast for the complete month of Ramadan for all 30 days? So the answer to that question is only like 30% or 40%. So depending upon the fasting rate, so the average treatment effect could be like 2 to 3 times, even more higher than the ITT. So which means that the average treatment effect could be as high as 9%. Second thing is, so the exposure is when you are in utero. So we are measuring outcome when you are adults. In between, a lot of things have happened. And these things include compensatory investment by parents and society. And to the extent this parental or societal investment is compensatory, so then the effects are attenuated to some extent, which we measure. And the third thing is we use tax return data to measure outcomes. So this gives us a lot of precision and power, but Sean knows it. And so people who are familiar with tax in public in developing countries know it, that in developing countries, the income tax returns are filed usually by the top 5-4% of the population. So which means we are capturing the right tail of the income distribution. So we are capturing the effect on the very rich. And the effects on the very rich, so they are always like milder than the effect in the population because there are more resources. So they don't have any liquidity constraints in investing in terms of investing into their kids. So because of that also, our estimate is underestimated. So then we are also going to like show you some interesting heterogeneity results, which I'm going to come up in a short time. So to give you like some background on why should like in utero exposure to Ramadan have a long run effect. And first we start with biological pathways. So for the steady, for the normal development of fetus or an embryo in mother's tummy, this steady supply of glucose in mother's blood is vital, because fetus and embryo, it feeds only on glucose. And when this supply of glucose is interrupted, so then the alternative biological, metabological mechanism of the body kicks in, and that is to burn fat. So when the supply of glucose is interrupted, body starts burning fat to compensate for the nutritional loss. So burning fat is good in the sense that it produces energy, but its byproducts, ketones and fatty acids, so they are like harmful, especially for the developing fetus. And they have been linked to like impairment and neurological impairment and diminished cognitive ability of the child. So the second biological mechanism is this accelerated starvation. Accelerated starvation is, so the glucose demand of a pregnant woman is already very high because all the glucose is being taken by the baby. So a second like evolutionary mechanism which protects the glucose supply to like embryo or fetus is that pregnant mothers, so they develop glucose tolerance as the pregnancy develops. So this glucose tolerance, this helps them divert most of glucose to the fetus. So their body is already using less and less glucose, and it's becoming insulin resistant. So when you are not taking enough glucose and your body is already glucose tolerant, so then this accelerated starvation can occur. And this is the idea that if a pregnant woman does not eat for 14 to 18 hours, in terms of biochemical state, their body can achieve a state which is only observed in extreme episodes of hunger and starvation. And so that's why an advice to pregnant women is always to never skip breakfast, because in the night you are without food for 12 hours almost. If you, on top of that, you do not take breakfast, so then you hit this limit of 14 to 18 hours without food, for which this accelerated starvation sets in. And there is evidence that this accelerated starvation has been observed among like Ramadan fasting pregnant women. Okay.
So did you also looking at the effect of these models?
So we won't be able to like distinguish between these biological mechanisms, because
I mean, did you, in your data, are you able to also see these models, these pregnant women?
no. So we are not going to observe them. That's why I said that our estimate will be intention to treat effect. So what we are going to observe is that you were in utero when the Ramadan occurred. So some of the mothers would have fasted, some would not have. That's why it's like intention to treat effect.
Okay.
And finally, the most important biological mechanism which links early life in utero exposure to like later life outcomes is these predictive adaptive responses. So our bodies are incredibly intelligent, and this intelligence has been owned by like millions and millions of years of evolution. So the idea here is when your body, I think this, you cannot read this, but anyway, I try to explain these predictive adaptive responses in words. So the idea is, so when the supply of glucose is interrupted in mother's blood, so the body takes it as a signal. The body takes it as a postcard from the future, that this is likely indicative of the things to come. So if the body feels that the future environment, the postnatal environment will be food stressed because there is already less glucose, so then the body makes some permanent changes. And these permanent changes are, they reduce body weight, they reduce metabolism rate, they increase fat storage, and these changes are permanent. So these are called predictive adaptive responses, because based on these cues in the mother's blood, the body predicts the environment that will be there after the baby is born, and then body tries to prime the baby to best survive in that predicted environment, at least until the reproductive age. So these changes, so these are like permanent. For example, if body feels that the future environment will be food stressed, so they would make the body efficient in like calorie usage. But then if you are born into a world which is rich in food, which is a world with like KFCs and McDonald's and crack and whatnot, so then your physiology and your environment is mismatched. So then the adaptation which happened during in utero, so that was a maladaptation. And because of that, you would be vulnerable to like diseases in your later life. So there are many biological mechanisms which link this in utero shocks to later life deficiency.
And can I ask a quick question?
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I also have a question.
Yeah.
Leandro, you go.
No.
Yes,
you raise first, Michael.
Yeah, Michael first.
So it's not directly related to biological point you're making, but I still wanted to ask it now. Do you have any information on domestic violence and other types of violence in Ramadan as opposed to outside? Because there's evidence, for example, that within Ramadan, economic growth is not that high, but then people are getting happier. So if there's a systematic change in how people feel and how they behave, A, towards each other in the home, which is very hard to observe, and B, cross-group violence, which might be easier to observe, then this could systematically affect your outcomes. Because let's say outside of Ramadan, domestic violence is higher and the rate of pregnancy losses is higher. That may occur at a particular end of the economic spectrum, and that might influence, you may not even observe those later on that otherwise would have been comparable to the ones that are born in Ramadan or outside. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I understand, but what I get is, so we do not have any data on this.
Yeah.
But let's assume that domestic violence is lower during Ramadan than it is in other periods. So then it's kind of acting against us. So then we should be like, we should not find any effect.
There's that option, but there's also the alternative. If I didn't eat all day, I mean, I would never be violent, but I could see people get really grumpy when they don't eat and drink all day. And I'm not observing Ramadan, I'm not Muslim, so I don't know how that works. But I mean, domestic violence is often in these individual level data. So you can't observe it, I understand that, but it's just such a big thing that is underlying that, because it happens to a much larger extent than most of us think. And I believe during pregnancy, that's probably, could be a major issue. So I wonder, it could go both ways. It could be introducing a floor into your estimates, or it could actually bias them upwards.
Yeah, my sense is, so the literature, especially the surveys, so which surveys have been done for these pregnant Muslim women. So one thing that comes up repeatedly, so not in one context, but in multiple contexts, is that the stress level of women during this month goes up, and this goes up by a lot. So one thing is, people are hypoglycemic, as you said. So if you have not eaten for like 18 hours, you're grumpy. So then, and all the anger would be directed toward like the weaker gender. So women are vulnerable during this process. So my sense is this is one of the shock that, so that's why we call it Ramadan shock, because it contains within it a lot of things. And my sense is all are negative. I still have to look at the data, but especially on domestic violence. But when you talk to women and when you listen to like these surveys, so most of it is that it negatively affects their like even mental state.
Yeah, but there's also social desirability bias, right? Like you wouldn't maybe talk about domestic violence. Anyways, I think you get my point. I think that's one thing I'd be worried about.
Yeah. So Leandro?
Sean? Yeah.
Yes. Two questions. First, is there a heterogeneity on the Ramadan effect at the time of where you are in your pregnancy? For example, if you're in the beginning of pregnancy or later in the pregnancy. And the second thing, it's about, there's we got here in the chat that says one of us posted that the association between Ramadan and fasting and health outcomes of offspring is not supported by strong evidence, but this more or less go against us. What are your story?
So sorry, I did not get your last point.
Somebody posted here that the association between Ramadan fasting and health outcomes of offspring is not supported by strong evidence, and cited, and there's a paper here. This doesn't more or less go against of your story?
Yeah, I'm not aware of that paper, but like there is a lot of evidence from like not in one context, but multiple contexts that it does. So the survey that I referred, Almond and Curry, so this is a JEP survey. So this survey was done in 2011. So then there is a survey in 2018. So I would refer like people to table 1 of this Almond and Curry survey in Journal of Economic Perspective. And it contains like many studies which show, not one, like many studies which show that this does negatively affect the outcomes. And plus I'm going to show you very convincing evidence. So I will skip this part because we are already running late, and I will show you the evidence to convince you it indeed has a negative effect. Okay. So we are going to like exploit 3 data sources. So one will be the tax returns, and using this, we are going to measure the labor market outcomes, which is your earnings, your occupational choice, and other outcomes. So then I also have to like rule out selection, so which we talked about earlier, that parents, they do not systematically time pregnancy to avoid exposure of their kids to Ramadan. For that, we are not going to use DHS survey, tax survey, because in tax survey, we cannot link children to parents. But we are lucky that we have a DHS survey, Demographic and Health Survey of Pakistan, which is run in many countries, including Pakistan. So here we can link the parental characteristics with children. We can link across generation, and we are going to show you that there is no selection. And then we are going to like use another data source for showing you that, for convincing you the mechanism through which this negative effect of Ramadan mediates. Okay. So what is our empirical strategy? So our empirical strategy is very simple, and I'm going to explain it using like this diagram. So this is the cohort which was conceived in 1974. So in our tax data, so we observe the date of birth of the individual. So we take away the normal gestation length of 266 days from the date of birth of the individual. So that gives us the conception date. So now if you look at these guys, so these guys are not exposed to Ramadan because they were conceived 2 months after Ramadan began, and they were born before the next Ramadan. For the entire length of 9 months that they remain in utero, so they were not exposed to Ramadan. So they are our reference category. So we are going to measure the outcomes of these. We are going to compare outcomes of these exposed groups relative to this certainly unexposed group. So then this is the other group. So they were conceived right after Ramadan ended in the next month, and they were again born before the start of the next month. They are also not exposed. So we are going to use them as a placebo and show you that there is no present parental sorting across these groups. So this is the group which are conceived during Ramadan. So they are partially exposed. So then we have all these 8-9 groups, so which are exposed to Ramadan, but in different pregnancy months. For example, this group, so they were exposed to Ramadan, so when they were 4 months after conception. Okay. And because we have a lot of data, we have a lot of power. So we are going to compare these certainly unexposed people to these exposed people, using these two as a placebo category to convince you that our empirical strategy, our identification strategy makes sense, it works. Okay. And so with this, let me start like showing you results. So the first, I promised you that I am going to rule out selection into Ramadan. And here what we show you is the birth rate. And here we are comparing the solar calendar, the Western calendar with the Islamic calendar, which is called Hijra calendar. So Ramadan follows this calendar, and this is the normal calendar we are used to. So there is like a birth seasonality in terms of the Western calendar, which is very clear to see. So more kids are born in summer than in winter. Okay, so in winter, in spring, less children are born. In summer, more kids are born. So this is like a very, very robust pattern, fertility pattern we observe in the data. But when we look at the Islamic calendar, so the birth rate is almost flat. So this is the line at 1/12, and this is the birth rate in various months. And birth rate at various months is very, very close to this flat line, so which is 1/12. So there does not seem to be any variation in birth rate across various months. So the second thing is, so even if there is no variation in birth rate, so you can still have like sorting of parents. Sorting of parents, so these are unexposed children. So they could have different parents than, for example, these children who were exposed in the 4 months of their gestation. So here we look at, so this is the gestation month of kids, and this is literacy of mother. And we compare people conceived in different months relative to Ramadan. So this is our omitted category. So this is our reference category. So these are certainly unexposed group. So we are comparing them to people who were conceived in different months. And in terms of literacy of mother, so they are not different. Similarly, we can look at education of mother, and again, so there is, we get a flat line. The parents do not seem to be systematically different across these groups. Similarly, we can look at partner education, we can look at wealth of the household, we look at like different outcomes. So this, again, so these are numbers relative to these diagrams. And what we get is that none of these, so the children's timing of conception in terms of Hijra calendar, this is not correlated with parental characteristics. Okay, and we look at not one, we look at more than 10 characteristics, whatever is available in the DHS data. And the second thing, yeah.
Sorry. So, but if you do the same regression, but if you use the Gregorian calendar,
yeah,
would you observe some differences?
Yeah, so that's what you asked for.
Ah, sorry.
Yeah, yeah. So if we do the exercise you asked for, we clearly see correlation. So here there is parental sorting across different conceptions. For example, the kids which are conceived in the second quarter of the Gregorian year, so they on average have like lower socioeconomic status parents than others. But we do not see such association in terms of the Hijra calendar. And the second thing I want to emphasize is that these estimates, so these are very precisely estimated zero. It's not that we so that we have large coefficient and large standard errors. In fact, we have very small coefficients and very small standard errors. There does not appear to be like any difference at all across these groups in terms of parental characteristics. Okay. And we can always reject the null that there is parental sorting of parents across various conception groups. Okay, so this is another thing we do, so which is basically operationalizing this thing. So we estimate a multinomial logistic model, and we regress a dummy of that you were conceived in a given quarter relative to Ramadan on your parent characteristics. And this here we are comparing people who were exposed to Ramadan in the first trimester of their pregnancy, second trimester of their pregnancy, third trimester of pregnancy. And all this is relative to people who were not exposed. And again, we get like flat lines. None of these parental characteristics, they do not predict the timing of conception of the kids in terms of the Hijra calendar. So my sense is like there is super strong evidence that there is no selection in timing of conception relative to Ramadan. Okay. So once you are like convinced with the story that there is no selection, so then the next logical step is to go ahead and estimate the effect of Ramadan shock. And here again, so we start with non-parametric evidence. Here what we do is divide people into 52 weeks. So this is your like conception date relative to Ramadan. So again, these are people who are not exposed. So this is our certainly unexposed category. So these are people who are exposed in various gestation periods. And what we are plotting here is just your average earning. So we have not done anything. So this is raw data. So this is average earning of people who were conceived in these months, in these weeks. And what we discover is like a very strange, very curious earnings exposure profile. So earnings go down, especially with exposure. And so these people, they have always the lowest earnings, and they kind of then recover and come back. So this U-shaped relationship, so this not only appears in the average earnings, but also in other moments of the distribution. For example, this is median, this is 25th percentile of the income distribution. So this is 75th percentile. And again, this U-shape persists. So then what we do is we do something more sophisticated. So which is we measure differences of earnings of these groups. So these are exposed groups. So this is certainly an exposed group relative to them. And this, like a hockey stick profile, this appears here. The people exposed in the middle period of pregnancy, so they on average have lower earnings relative to the unexposed group. So this is raw difference. We do not include any control variables. So when we include like the month of birth fixed effect, so as I told you, the birth seasonality could be important. So people born in like summer could be different from people born in winter and so on. So when you put in month of birth fixed effects, nothing changes, and should not be surprising because we have 66 birth cohorts and Ramadan follows is so it's like these different months, so they're balanced in our sample because during 66 years, Ramadan has completed 2 cycles in the Western calendar.
Mazhar, can I have a quick query here? So the horizontal axis is about the gestation month at the start of Ramadan. So before zero means that they are not exposed at all, or?
So they're partially exposed. So they were conceived in the same month that Ramadan began in.
Okay, and a minus one will be exposed too?
So minus one will not be exposed. So they were conceived 1 month after Ramadan, and they were born before the start of new Ramadan. So these are people who were conceived 2 months after Ramadan.
Okay, I see. Okay. So that you're expecting that going. So if we go from the left to the right,
yeah,
this declining trend is what you expected.
Yes.
Yeah.
So once we put in like district of birth fixed effect, nothing changes. But because we are measuring outcome at the same time for multiple cohorts, so when we put in the year of birth, so now what we are doing is comparing people born in the same cohort after taking into account any birth seasonality, after taking into account any spatial variation in earnings. So this is our like the most preferred specification.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
What we get is, so this is certainly unexposed group. So these two are partially exposed or exposed group. So there is no significant difference between these 3 outcomes. But once your exposure starts, so then your earnings are distinctly lower than the reference group. And because there is no selection into these groups, I have already shown you that. So then this is the causal effect of Ramadan exposure. And this is large, so this would be like 4-5% in certain groups. And then this group is also like partially exposed. So these are the guys which are essentially born in Ramadan. So they were conceived 9 months before Ramadan. So they were born in Ramadan. So some of them would have experienced Ramadan in utero for like 1 day, some for 2 days, and so on. So this is very convincing in the sense that this group is also partially exposed, and we do not see any earning decline for them. So these 3 groups, so they are also, so this is certainly not exposed, this is certainly not exposed, this is partially exposed. And again, we do not find anything here. But here in the middle part of the pregnancy, the earnings are distinctly lower. Okay. So if you combine this picture with this sorry, with this picture. So that gives you like the idea. So there is no parental sorting. So parental characteristics are very similar across these groups. Our horizontal axis is the same across both these diagrams. But when you look at earnings, so there is definitely earnings of these group, these people are lower. Okay, so these are numbers, and I'm going to skip the numbers. So, but whatever way we look at it, so there is like the negative effect of Ramadan exposure on earnings. Okay, so
could
there
you
were
please,
questions.
Mazhar?
Yeah.
Could you
Yeah.
please clarify two questions? Here's when you talk about the earnings, at what time do you measure the earning of the kids? And secondly, just when you talk about this control for the month of birth, do you mean the Gregory month?
Yeah, so when we say control for the month of birth, so this Gregorian month, and so this is only because of like variation in weather, temperatures.
Yeah.
And we already showed you that there is some sorting of parents across the Gregorian calendar month. So we have to control for that. But that does not matter, and it's only because this our sample is balanced across these months. Okay. And so we measure earnings at different ages. So whoever files return, income tax returns, that is in our data. So that's why we condition on the year of birth fixed effects. So ultimately, what we are comparing here are people born in the same year. So some were exposed to Ramadan and some were not. So then we are essentially comparing people of similar age. So in one of robustness checks, so instead of like year of birth fixed effect, what we do is flexibly control for age, and we get similar results as well. Okay, so the next is like we have already talked about that we do not observe the fasting rate, actual fasting rate in our population. So what we observe is that when you were in utero, so there was Ramadan, and potentially you were exposed to it. But we do not observe if your mother actually did fast or not. So to compensate for that, we look at like the treatment intensity through another way. So we argue that so this fasting is done as a religious obligation. So which means people who are more religious, so they are more likely to fast. And we proxy here religiosity of the family at the time of birth by the given name of the person. And we say if the person is named Muhammad, so then the family is more likely to be religious. And since the names are chosen at the time of birth, so this indicates religiosity of the family, religiousness of the family at the time of event of our interest. So then we compare people who have like name Muhammad with others. So we get the point estimates are consistent with our like a priori expectations, so that they have, so their effects are on average higher. But obviously these differences are not statistically significant for most of the groups because these confidence intervals do overlap. Okay. So the treatment intensity does seem to matter. So then the other thing we look at, so I have shown you so far only earnings. So there is negative effect on earnings. But obviously we are interested in mechanisms, and one of the so for understanding mechanism, we look at like other outcomes. So this is the occupation. And again, so I have only 9 minutes left. So the takeaway from this occupation exercise is that on average, the exposed group, they choose dominated occupations. For example, they are less likely to be employees, and employees in developing countries, so they earn more than the non-employees, especially in our data. And we show that employees, on average, they are more educated than non-employees, and they have higher income. The second thing is, so we observe like four-digit occupation code in our data. And based on this 4-digit occupation code, we divide occupation into high-skilled occupations and low-skilled occupations. So high-skilled occupations are occupations like consulting, finance, where you need some qualification to operate. And high-skilled occupations, low-skilled occupations are occupations like working for retail or wholesale. So when we do that, so the exposed children, so they are less likely to be in high-skilled professions. And they are more likely to be in low-skilled professions. So that's like very robust. But this is not the entire story. Even if you look at like within employees or within high-skilled professions, so still on average, the exposed children are less. Then the story is both about occupation choice and differences within occupations. So our sense is this. So let me show you like the heterogeneity results, and then I can talk convincingly about mechanisms. So when we compare older cohorts with younger cohorts, so then we do not find any like statistical differences. So this negative earning effect, this could arise from 2 reasons. So one is the skill channel and the other is the health channel. So the skills channel is that on birth, the exposed children, they are born with lower cognitive and non-cognitive skills. And because of dynamic complementarities and self-productivity in this human skill formation process, so this had persistent long-run negative effect on their earnings. So this is one story. So this is one causal story under the skills channel. So there is an alternative story as well. The alternative story is that the exposed children, so they were born with worse health. So they had poor health at birth. And somehow that poor health persisted throughout their lives, and that affected their outcomes. So this health story, according to biomedical literature, so as I told you, the evolutionary mechanisms, so these predictive adaptive responses. So what they do is they prime the body. So they reprogram the body to remain optimal at least till the reproductive age, which is like until your 30s, 40s, you remain in your prime, and then you decline sharply because the supposed objective of evolution has been fulfilled. But so if this health channel is the main channel driving our results, then we should what we should observe is that these exposed children, so they remain quite similar to the unexposed till their 30s and 40s, but after that their outcomes decline by a lot. But what we do is we do not find any difference between younger and older cohorts in terms of this negative effect on earning. So then our preferred explanation is that this is more likely to be like a skill story. So where these exposed children, so they are born with like lower capacities to acquire these cognitive and non-cognitive skills. As a result, investments into them for acquiring these skills, they are less productive, and they end up making dominated occupation choices. And even within occupation choices, they earn less than the unexposed because of their lower abilities and capacities. That is our preferred explanation. So one last bit of result, which before I conclude, is that the earlier literature has also found the effect of Ramadan exposure on sex ratio. And the idea here is that survival of a species depends on the number of females that it has rather than the number of males it has. So when the survival is threatened, when food is scarce, so then automatically the females, more females are produced relative to males. So one of the way this Rivers-Villard hypothesis works is that at the time of conception, if glucose is low in mother's body, so then there are some studies, especially in animals, which suggest that then it's more likely to produce a female rather than a male. And there is some evidence of this, like environmentally driven sex ratios among animals. Even some of the economics literature, they do find that the in utero exposure to Ramadan, this has some effect on sex ratios, tilting it towards female. But in our setup, we do not find any effect on sex ratios. And if you do not have any questions, so then I conclude. So what we do is we look at the causal connection between adverse nutrition event in utero and later life outcomes. And what we find is that this matters, and your lifetime earnings are 2 to 3% lower, which is a lower bound relative to the unexposed. So Ramadan is a mild shock, but children born in 9 out of 12 months are exposed. And if we take this, our estimate seriously, so which means your earnings of exposed children are lower by 3%, average treatment effect would be as high as 9%, but 75% of the children are exposed, and we translate this into like macroeconomic loss of GDP for every year. So we find that this reduces GDP by $2.3 billion annually in Pakistan and $13.8 billion globally. And as I told you earlier, religiously, this is not obligatory. This fasting is not obligatory. So there is conditional exemption available to pregnant women, so they can leave it and come back to it after Ramadan, after their pregnancy. So our sense is if you can run awareness programs to convince women that this is bad and they can do it later, so then their Pareto gains can be made. So this seems like a free lunch. So with the caveat that these are likely to be protected beliefs. So when it comes to like people's identity or religion or something, so they do not acquire and process information as a rational person would. So with that caveat, so there could be like interesting intervention in this area. So I stop here and I look forward to any follow-up question or suggestions.
Yeah. Yes. Thanks, Mazhar. Very excellent time control. So I think audience raised question. So who is the first? Let me see.
I want to ask a question.
Yeah. So Sam.
My question is, I just wondered, do you have information about the mother's age and other characteristics? Would it be, is it possible that older mothers would be more likely to have pregnancy during the Ramadan, and that could affect the results?
Yeah, in our first set of results, so where I showed you selection into Ramadan exposure.
I understand.
So yeah.
But do you?
So
but you don't have the mother's characteristics, right? You show us the wealth and education and so on.
Yeah, so that was what I was about to say, that we do not do it with mother's age, but let me have a look at the data. If we have mother's age in our data, then that would be interesting. We can look for selection along this line.
Yeah.
Yeah, next, Tusha.
So Sean, I might want to go last because I have a few questions, so you can.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. You're very polite. So Emil.
Yes, just a quick one. So there are 30 years between the treatment and the outcome. So I wonder how survival bias might play a role there, in particular in the first exercise, the first regression that you show that there is no correlation between education and wealth and timing of conception. So does that regression include all births that took place in 74, or only the birth that you can match with your tax returns data?
No, so our DHS regressions, so they're not matched to our like tax data. So this is the whole universe, and this DHS survey, so this is representative of population.
Okay.
So this is nationally representative.
Right.
And this is not matched to text data. But your question on survival is like really important question. And so the idea here is that there is some selection going on the basis of survival as well. And this is another reason for which all estimates in this literature, so they are like lower bounds. And the idea here is, let's say the people who are worst affected, so they may not be born. The pregnancy may be aborted because the fetus is, the shock to fetus is severe. Or there could be like selective mortality. So that there could be selective mortality at birth or later. So the worst affected children, so they do not survive. So in the sense of, because we are measuring outcomes using survivors' outcomes only. So to some extent, so there is positive selection into this data based on like selective mortality. So then whatever we report is lower bound on account of that. But on top of that, in our setup, because we are measuring outcomes using tax return data, so there is another like layer of positive selection into data that not only you survived the shock, but you also became a taxpayer. So which means you were in the top 5% of the population. So the worst affected individuals, they probably were selected out. So that's one other reason our estimate is like a lower bound.
What about the effect of wars during this period? There were a few wars in Pakistan.
So there were like 2 wars. So we do not like look at any heterogeneity like along that dimension. So your idea is during war. So this shock will be like even stronger.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So yeah, so next is it is Hoy. Sorry, because here the name is not very clear.
Okay, thanks, Sean. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm here. Yeah. I have a comment, actually. It's not a question. So, and the person who posted the comment, the association between Ramadan fasting and health outcomes of offspring is not supported by strong evidence, as Leandro mentioned earlier. So I also read the paper, the draft of the paper before the presentation, and I see that the authors did not include some recent literature on the same topic that might have some like contrasting arguments to the presentation. And so actually I and 2 other colleagues at UWA, I did an analysis using DHS data for 56 countries and the same topic in utero exposure to Ramadan and child nutrition. And we did not find any difference between the exposed and unexposed children, controlling for mothers' characteristics such as education, age, and wealth index, etc., and or occupation. So, and my comment is the story you are presenting might be true for Pakistan, but not necessarily true for other countries. So you might extrapolate the results to the economic loss for Pakistan, but I think you should not extrapolate the result for the whole world economies. So just as my comment. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's interesting, but like, so the pitch of our paper is that these survey data, so they have a lot of measurement errors. So that's the measurement challenge that I mentioned at the start. So these survey data, so I'm not sure so what outcomes you are measuring in the DHS. Because of measurement error so, and lack of statistical precision, so the null effect that you find does not mean that there is no effect in the population. It could be just that you do not have enough power to detect it, only because the treatment is mild and the outcomes are measured long time after the treatment. And if you do not have the power necessary to estimate the effect, then you are not going to find an effect. So in that sense, I'm not surprised that you do not find anything in DHS data. But my sense is if you do the similar exercise using this type of data, you will find it. So the second thing is, so in survey, the recall ability matters. So because you are asking questions about like past. So if somehow recall ability is also affected by like your Ramadan exposure, so then these survey outcomes, so they're themselves biased by the exposure. So I will like not be discouraged that you do not find this effect in the DHS data. In fact, that is the selling point of a paper, that you have to do it using the right type of data with the right type of like precision and power.
Okay. Thanks, Mazhar. I think controversies make the research more valuable. Yeah, so it's a very good debate. Okay, so next, Girish.
Thanks, Sean. Very interesting presentation, Mazhar. So I wanted to ask, this slide is very interesting, slide number 22, and maybe you have already done this in the paper as well, but do you have something similar, but for, say, for example, how Muslims from different, literacy, education, wealth backgrounds observe Ramadan, which is basically adherence to Ramadan? Does that change with these observables? That's one question. And the other bit is, again, not necessarily emanating from the data that you have, but do you have any, measurement on, say, for example, the weight of the newborn baby, which again kind of varies with how, the wealth, etc. The other observable characteristics vary of the household. Where I'm getting at is, obviously these factors will influence how Ramadan or exposure to Ramadan in utero affects later outcomes in life, right? So because it's very much possible that people from better households are able to cope better, or they don't adhere or observe Ramadan as much as you would expect them to. So even though what you're finding is correct and maybe causal, but you can have significant heterogeneity in the effect, right? So that would be very interesting. Maybe you've already done that and maybe I missed it. But I was very keen to know if you've already done that or you plan on doing that.
Yeah, no, it's like very important question. So we do not have any data in DHS or related to Pakistan in that. But in the paper, so we have like produced more than 19 surveys from different countries. So these surveys, so they ask pregnant women about their like fasting habits. And some of them, they try to correlate it to like these socioeconomic variables like education, income, and there is like some negative correlation. The educated women are less likely to fast during pregnancy, and more richer women, they're less likely to fast during pregnancy. So that's important, but you have also like, so very rightly identified their consequence. So their consequence is not that they're creating any selection bias, because we do not find any selection into Ramadan exposure, but how our average effect is driven by. Our average effect could be driven by only like the poorer women because the adherence there was greater than others, or it could be driven by low income women, mothers, because their adherence was far more than. So this is how this average is driven by. And this we cannot like pinpoint because we do not have data on these mothers.
Yeah, no, I agree. It'll be very interesting to see that if you can, because that heterogeneity in itself would be very insightful. Okay, no worries.
Yes, so Mazhar, can I just cut in to follow Girish's comment here? I think maybe you can just do more analysis on the heterogeneity effect based on the parents' characteristics, especially for example, the wealth, income, that may use your universal data to shed light on the selected sample like the survey. That means you know under what kind of characteristic of the parents, okay, then what kind of the outcome you may observe from the data. That can help you even answer some selection questions in the selected survey. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's like very interesting, very good suggestion. But like we do not have parental characteristics in our text data. So we do in the DHS data, but not in the text data. So that's why we rule out selection using DHS data. But when we were, so if we want to know how our average effect is driven by, and there we cannot do any heterogeneity on like parental characteristics. So the type of heterogeneity we explore in the current version of the paper is between young and old cohorts. The people who were exposed to Ramadan in like extreme weather, so which is May and June in Pakistan, relative to others, and people who live in like big cities relative to less affluent cities. And our sense is this to some extent is capturing the effect of parental income. Because if you are living in a big city, so then maybe your parents were on average richer than other parents. So, but we do not find like any different effect for these kids. So whatever heterogeneity we explore, so the effect seems to be quite uniform across the population.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks. And Tushar, thanks for your patience.
Oh, that's me.
Yeah.
Leandro is next.
Okay. Oh yeah, so Leandro.
I am this number.
Yeah.
You cannot see. Okay. I have two questions. The first one that surprised me is the following: parents that doesn't select when the child is going to be born according to Ramadan, but they select according to the Gregorian calendar.
Yeah.
So there's some selection going on about the parents. This is looks like for me contradictory. So basically, they take Ramadan as orthogonal, but at the same time they are religious. So this is something that it's awkward for me. And my second comment, go back to Tushar. I think it's about that question that he raised about Bangladesh and Pakistan. I mean, where you see evidence in Bangladesh that people select according to Ramadan parent characteristics helps to select date of birth following their Ramadan. We do not see this in Pakistan. This is also for me, it's somehow puzzling, unless your sample, because it's just higher income. I mean, this doesn't affect the higher incomes group. So those are my two comments.
No, so these are important questions, and as I said, so we take selection seriously because this is like the key identification concern for us. So that's why half of the paper is devoted to this issue. So you said, so there is like selection in terms of like Western.
I mean, when you look to the Gregorian, the parents are selecting.
Yeah.
But it don't. When we took to the Ramadan, they do not select. So they seem. I mean, they fast. I don't know. I mean, for me, it's awkward. They take selection in one dimension, but not in the other dimension. This for me, it's very surprising.
It's not awkward at all. So if you ask me what is the date today, I will tell you it's 25th March. If you ask me what's the date today in terms of Hijra calendar, I don't know. I have to Google. And if you have like a Muslim person in the audience, you can ask them what's the date today in terms of Hijra calendar. They won't be knowing it. So I'm telling you. So the Western calendar matters because all our planning decisions, even in Muslim countries, so they are taken in terms of this calendar. So we plan our life according to this. So the Hijra calendar is not salient. So other than like Eid or this Ramadan or few other religious festivals, it's rarely used. The second thing is it changes every year. So it's not that Ramadan always starts on the 15th of May. So it does not. So if it starts 15th of May this year, next year it will be like 5th of May. And so in 33 years, it will be all around the Western calendar. So then you cannot plan. The third thing is you do not even know in advance. So what will be the date 1 month after that in terms of Hijra calendar? Because it depends on the sighting of the moon. So if the moon, sometimes moon appears after 29 days, sometimes after 30 days. So you cannot have a calendar. So because of these reasons, this calendar is not used in planning decisions. Second thing is, so these surveys about pregnant women, so they ask them, do you think that fasting during pregnancy is likely to affect your baby? And most of them say that they do not perceive any harm in doing so. And this comes up repeatedly after surveys. So if you are not perceiving any harm from doing this, and if the calendar is not salient, so then it should not be surprising that people are not like choosing time in terms of this. I haven't seen the Bangladesh evidence, but there is like Almond and Mazumdar paper in AJ Applied. So they look at Indonesia, they look at Iraq, they look at Arab population in Michigan. So then there is Almond and Mazumdar paper in Economic Journal. So they look at the Muslim and Bangladeshi population in the UK. So there is another paper in Journal of Health Economics. They look at Indonesian Muslims. So there's like a lot of empirical evidence that there is no selection into Ramadan exposure on the basis of timing of conceptions. I'm not aware of this Bangladesh paper. I will have a look. But like there is weight of evidence that exists now is that this does not matter.
And this independent of your social class.
Yeah.
So Mazhar, my points actually follow from what Leandro was asking. I trust you and I believe the literature that there is not a lot of selection, especially Farhan has also worked on this and Almond's work. But what I find like curious is why is that the case, right? There are clear large impacts and a rational agent, a forward-looking agent will factor that into to their objective function, right? Even after 60 years or maybe 100 years of this happening, people haven't taken that into consideration, right? And you make an argument about salience, and I agree with you that could be part of the argument. But for salience to drive such big results, it's kind of curious, right? I mean, you would, in other settings, people actually take these things into account, right? So that's one as to why they are not optimizing properly. It's not because of a lack of technology, right? They are spacing their births according to the Gregorian calendar. So the technology to space birth definitely exists. So it's not a technology argument, right? It has to be a behavioral demand side argument. The second argument is very similar to what Girish was pointing out, that, and this kind of brings in Hoy's point as well, that the most of the paper that I have read about Ramadan are looking at things like wages or even education in some setting, right? And it could very well be that the perception or the child is born with worse health, but as you pointed out, the investments that follow kind of reinforce. We know that poorer people reinforce the investment. So going back to the DHS, and I know you don't have it in your tax data, could you show reinforcement for poorer households and compensation for richer households to make the argument that perhaps the Ramadan shock directly did not have that impact, that big an impact, but the investments that followed kept reinforcing the initial differences, and so it blew up somehow, right? So that, and the third one, which is a minor point, is so you use the name of the child, which is pretty clever, I must say. But could you also, because this is tax data, so you'll have information on how much zakat they paid last year, right? And that is a very good indicator of religiosity. It's a voluntary payment. People who pay more are more religious on an average, right? And so could that be an indicator that you use in addition to names?
So no, thanks a lot. So this is like very, very interesting suggestion. So I will start from the last. So zakat paid, like we can proxy the religiousness of the family using this, but there are two problems. So one is we don't have a lot of power. So in tax data, so you can claim an so zakat is a deductible expense. So if you report you have paid zakat, so then you can claim some reduction in your tax liability. But very few people, they report paying zakat. And it is because most of zakat is paid informally.
Yeah.
They don't have receipts, so they cannot claim deduction, so they do not report it on tax return. We don't have power. The second thing is what we have data on is whether you paid zakat or not. But you, after 40 years of your birth, would be religious, but it doesn't mean your mother would be religious. So with this name, so name are chosen at the time of birth. So this indicates the religiousness of the family at the time of birth. That's why we decided to use. So your next question on compensation versus reinforcement. So this is like $1 million question. So we can have an AER if that data is available, because that data. So my sense is there's huge gap in the literature, and it is because what happened. So there's a lot of evidence that these early life events, they matter a lot. But most of this literature is that there was an early shock and there is an effect later in the life. But what happens in between? So that's kind of dark and murky, and we do not know. And we do not have a lot of empirical evidence. And my sense is the DHS data is not going to help us because they do not have many outcomes.
So I remember Farham wrote a recent paper looking at DHS data from 14 countries, and he finds some evidence cross-country of reinforcement. So I don't know if that paper is still a working paper or was published, but might be useful to look at some point.
Yeah, again, so I'm sorry, so I'm not aware of that paper, but I will.
No, that's okay. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah.
And even theoretically, so it's not clear whether you so even if we talk about like a central planner, benevolent central planner, it's not clear whether parents should reinforce or compensate their investment. And the reason is, so we do not know if later investment in children's life, so they are complements or substitutes of the earlier investment. So there is a clear divide. For example, the part of the brain which controls like your socio-economic, socio-emotional skills, so that remains plastic till the age of 21. So there is some complementarity in investment into non-cognitive.
Yeah.
But your cognitive skills, your IQ scores, so they stabilize at the age of 10. And there is evidence that later investments, they kind of are not as productive as earlier investments.
Yeah.
In that case, so there should not be like any compensatory investment, even by the central planner, because the later investments, they are not a substitute for earlier investments. And because of this complementarity, in fact, if you have a negative shock, you should match that negative shock with later investments because they are not productive.
One thing I would want to add to that point is basically, so the literature that you're citing from Heckman and all, obviously the dynamic complementarity comes from the US data, right? The Perry School Survey and all. But if you look at what Rosenzweig and others have done in Pakistan and Bangladesh, their argument is it depends on the gender of the child, right? So there's a brain-brawn divide in the market.
Yeah.
So you would invest, but in different aspects of kids. For boys, you'll invest in their health. For girls, you'll invest in their education. So perhaps you could, the gender, you could differentiate by that, and perhaps there's something there that is informative.
Yeah, that is right. Yeah, I totally agree. So your earlier question was why parents are not optimizing. So so to me, this is not a surprise. So one thing is there is absolutely no awareness among the population that this negatively affect the child. The second thing is even the cases so where there is like clear connection. For example, if you're diabetic, you should not fast. Or if you have like a kidney issue, you should not fast. So there's like a lot of very clear medical reasons for not fasting if you are diabetic or if you have like kidney issues. But still the fasting rate is quite high even among these people. So it's kind of like, so I talked briefly about it in my last slide, that these are kind of protected beliefs. So people do not act rationally when it comes to their religion, their identity, their nationhood. So they do not process information in a rational manner. So my sense is it's not surprising because of two reasons. One is there is absolute lack of awareness that this is negative. And the second thing is, even if there is awareness, people are going to like value that information less because this affects their protected beliefs.
That's a point. Thanks.
Okay. So thanks, Tusha. And any other questions? Okay, great. And thanks, Mazhar. And I think personally, I think it is a fascinating work based on the amazing tax return data, universal and very careful empirical work. I think, yeah, I think the audience also give very good feedback and questions. Okay, I'm not the expert in this field. I feel, okay, this topic is still in debate. I think personally, I think it is makes your research more valuable. And the empirical evidence is quite convincing to me. So people just want to know more about the details of the mechanism, and that is more about this, I think, biological mechanism and other related issues that is not available. Information is not available in the data. Yeah, so I think, but you have pushed forward in this regard by using this universal data to show us the conclusion with some convincing empirical strategy. That's my personal take. Yeah. Okay. So thanks for attending this seminar. And so our time is up now. And if you are still interested in this topic, I think you can send email to Mazhar and keep discussion. And thanks for Mazhar, and thanks giving us such a fascinating talk at your early morning at 7 o'clock. And thanks.
No, thanks a lot, Sean. Yeah, and thanks a lot for all this like very like healthy discussion around this topic. So this is the maximum amount of feedback that I received during any seminar that I gave. So really grateful.
Yeah.
And so it's late in parts, so people are being held for going for their weekend activities. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, great. I'm happy to know that the comments are helpful, but unfortunately, because many of my colleagues, they have the family duties, they have to leave early, especially in the on Friday afternoon. So but I think, yeah, so still get some good feedbacks. I'm very happy with that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.